Imagine serving your country for 27 years, surviving 2 wars, earning medals that most people only read about, and then coming home to a neighborhood that treats you like an intruder. That's exactly what happened to war hero Richard Hale, a retired Army Master Sergeant, when his own HOA declared war on him over something he believed he had every right to protect. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment, "Respect our veterans" to support stories like this. Richard Hale wasn't the kind of man who asked for attention. For nearly 3 decades, he served quietly, carried his scars privately, and believed his retirement would finally bring him peace. After selling his old family home, he moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood called Maple Ridge Estates, a place advertised as the cleanest, safest community in the county. At first glance, it seemed perfect. Fresh-cut lawns, identical mailboxes, neatly spaced oak trees. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. But behind those perfect fences was something Richard didn't expect. An HOA board that treated rules like weapons. Richard moved in with only a few things that truly mattered to him: his medals, his folded service flag, and an old, weathered truck he had driven during his last deployment. To him, the truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a memory of brothers lost, battles survived, and a promise he made to never forget where he came from. On his first morning in the neighborhood, he woke up early, as all soldiers do, grabbed his coffee, stepped outside, and placed a small American flag at the edge of his lawn. Not a giant pole, not a loud display, just a simple flag staked into the soil, a quiet symbol of gratitude. By noon, a letter was taped to his door. Not a welcome note, not a neighbor greeting, a violation notice. It stated, "Unapproved lawn items are prohibited. Remove immediately or face fines." Richard read it twice, convinced it was a mistake. A small flag? On his own lawn? Surely they didn't mean that. But the next day, a second note appeared, then a third. Each one harsher than the last. Neighbors told him the HOA president, Diana Crowley, was known for enforcing rules without mercy. She didn't care who you were. If you didn't follow her book, she came after you. Still, Richard stayed calm. He had diffused situations far worse than this. He believed reason would win. So he attended the next HOA meeting, polite, respectful, folder of documents in hand, to simply ask why honoring his country was a problem. But when he walked into that room, the board members didn't see a veteran. They saw a rule breaker. Before he even took his seat, Diana announced, "Mr. Hale, your flag must come down. This community has standards." Richard lifted his chin, steady, unshaken. "Ma'am, I've carried this flag into places where men didn't return. It's staying." The room fell silent. Some neighbors looked embarrassed. Others whispered. But Diana didn't blink. Her voice was cold. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA will take action. Fines, property hearings, potential removal from the community." And that's when Richard realized this wasn't about a flag. This was about control. This HOA believed they owned the street, but they had just picked a fight with a man who once held the line for an entire nation. And Richard Hale was not about to back down. The confrontation at the mailbox had shaken the entire cul-de-sac, far more than the HOA board realized. While the board members retreated to their tidy homes, whispering behind closed curtains, the neighbors stood frozen. Most of them weren't angry at the veteran. They were embarrassed. Embarrassed that they had watched quietly while a man, who had served his country with honor, was spoken to like a trespasser on the very street he helped pay to build. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the neighborhood returned to life. Garage doors drummed open, sprinklers clicked on, porch lights glowed. But the rumor of what happened traveled faster than the evening breeze. Kids told their parents. Parents told their group chats. And by nightfall, the entire subdivision knew one thing. The HOA had picked a fight with the wrong man. Inside his home, Colonel Harris wasn't angry. He was disappointed. He stood in the hallway surrounded by framed medals, faded photographs, and shadow boxes holding pieces of the life he had lived long before this neighborhood existed. Parachute wings, unit patches, even a small American flag, folded tightly into a triangle, signed by every member of his last deployment team. He had fought in 2 wars. He had seen young men freeze in fear, rise in courage, and fall in sacrifice. He had seen cities crumble and communities rebuild. but he had never expected to come home and be treated like someone who didn't belong. His daughter, Lily, watched him from the dining table. "Dad," she said softly, "are you going to file a complaint?" He smiled, that small, calm, disciplined smile only soldiers carry. "No," he said. "I'm going to follow the rules, but I'll make sure they follow them too." That night, Colonel Harris didn't sleep much. Not out of anger, but out of responsibility. He knew this wasn't just about him. An HOA is supposed to protect property values and maintain order, not intimidate residents, especially those who contributed to the freedoms they enjoyed. He knew he had to do something the right way. The next morning, he dressed in a crisp, button-down shirt and walked to the community center where the HOA kept its weekly records. There was no uniform, no badges, no medals, just a quiet dignity and steady steps of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. The HOA secretary, startled by his presence, straightened her glasses. "Colonel Harris, can I help you?" "Yes," he said politely. "I'd like to request the full bylaws, amendment history, and enforcement logs for the last 3 years, and I'd like to exercise my right to record this request." Her eyebrows shot up. No one had ever asked for that much transparency before. Is there a reason?" "There is," he replied. "The board believes they own this street, but the law disagrees. I'd like the documentation to show the difference." Word spread again. A veteran challenging the HOA, legally, calmly, respectfully. Some neighbors admired him, some were nervous. But everyone felt something shift. For the first time, the HOA realized they weren't dealing with someone who would crumble under pressure. They were dealing with someone who spent his life under pressure. Later that evening, as Colonel Harris reviewed the documents at his kitchen table, something became clear. The HOA had been selectively enforcing rules. Not evenly, not fairly, and in ways that violated not just their own bylaws, but state housing laws. He found photos that weren't submitted, violations that weren't recorded, and multiple cases where the board overlooked certain homeowners while coming down hard on others. But the biggest discovery came last. A clause buried deep in the original founding documents nearly a decade old. A clause stating that the property line of the community sidewalk extended beyond the point the HOA claimed, meaning the mailbox the HOA accused him of trespassing near wasn't even in HOA enforcement territory. It technically belonged to the city, not the HOA, not the board, not the president who had puffed out his chest the day before. The HOA had overstepped, badly. Colonel Harris leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking to embarrass anyone. But he was looking for accountability, the same thing he demanded of every soldier he ever led. The next step was clear. He gathered the documents, placed them neatly into a folder, and began preparing his case for the next HOA meeting. Not an argument, not a confrontation, a statement. Professional, factual, and powerful. But the neighborhood wasn't done with its surprises. The following afternoon, while he sat on his porch sipping coffee, a young couple walked over nervously. They had witnessed the mailbox incident. They had said nothing, but the look on the veteran's face that day had stayed with them. "Colonel," the man said, "we just want to say, we're sorry. The way they spoke to you, it wasn't right. And if you need us to speak at the meeting, we will." He nodded, appreciating their courage more than their apology. Next came another neighbor, then another, then a family he barely knew. By dusk, 6 households had offered to support him. The very street the HOA claimed to own was now standing with the veteran who had defended much larger territories. Meanwhile, the HOA president sat inside his home, pacing, sweating, replaying the confrontation over and over. He had no idea the storm that was coming, only that it was headed straight for him. Colonel Harris didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't need to. He had the truth. He had the community. And soon he would have the entire HOA board listening. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to something no one expected. A crisp white envelope sat in front of every doorstep. Same handwriting. Same stamp, same message stamped on the front. For every homeowner's eyes only. Most people assumed it was another HOA notice, another rule update, another warning about mailbox colors or lawn length. But when they opened it, they froze. Inside the envelope was a copy of the violation letter sent to James Carlisle, every insulting line, every threat of fines, every demand to remove the flag he fought for. And attached to it, a photo of James standing in uniform, holding his Purple Heart, his leg bandaged, his face younger but determined. Beside the photo, he had written one simple note. "If this flag offends you, I fought for your right to feel that way." By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing like a shaken beehive. People gathered on sidewalks, clutching the letter, passing it around, whispering, arguing, defending, questioning. Some were furious at the HOA, some were shocked they had spoken to James for years and never knew what he had survived, and some quiet. Embarrassed, finally realized they had looked down on the wrong man. But the real storm hadn't arrived yet. Around 3 p.m., James received another envelope on his own porch. Thicker, heavier, official-looking. Inside was a summons, a formal notice, calling him to a disciplinary hearing with the HOA board. His crime? Non-compliance with HOA regulations, failure to remove unauthorized fixture, public distribution of internal HOA documents. It was no longer about a flag. It was about control. The HOA wanted to make an example out of him. James stared at the paper for a long moment, the afternoon sun highlighting the lines carved into his weathered face. But instead of anger, he smiled. Because James Carlisle had faced worse enemies in darker places than this HOA boardroom. He had walked through sandstorms, firefights, and nights where survival felt optional. This was just a room, with chairs, and people who had forgotten what sacrifice truly looked like. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the neighborhood watched from their windows as something unusual happened. 3 cars pulled up outside James's home, one after another. Out stepped men wearing military caps, jackets, medals pinned above their hearts, some from the Army, some Navy, one Marine. Friends, brothers, people who had bled beside him. They had heard what happened, and they were not going to let him walk into that HOA meeting alone. The street fell silent as they lined up in front of James's porch. Not as a show of force, but as a line of honor. Not one word was spoken. They didn't need to speak. Because tomorrow, the HOA would learn exactly who they were dealing with, and the street that they claimed to own belonged to someone who had earned it in ways they could never measure. The next morning, Cedar Pine Lane felt different. For the first time in years, neighbors stepped outside not to whisper, but to watch. The man they'd seen harassed, fined, and threatened was now standing tall on the street he had practically built with his own hands. As the sun rose, Harold placed his coffee mug on the railing and quietly scanned the neighborhood. His world had shifted overnight, but so had everyone else's, because now the whole street knew the truth. No one expected what happened next. Mrs. Callahan, a woman who had always avoided eye contact, slowly walked toward Harold with a nervous smile. Behind her, 3 more neighbors emerged, and then another. Within minutes, a small group gathered at the edge of his yard. People who had kept silent for far too long. They owed him more than they ever admitted. One neighbor spoke first, a trembling voice, a guilty voice. "Harold, we should have defended you before. We knew what the HOA was doing wasn't right, but everyone was afraid of the fines. The letters, the retaliation." Harold didn't judge them. He simply nodded. "I spent my life fighting. For people who couldn't always fight for themselves," he said quietly. "But here I just wanted to live. I never expected I'd need to fight again." But he wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was simply standing in the truth. And that truth had finally reached the people who needed to hear it. Just then, 3 HOA board members, those who were normally filled with arrogance, walked up. Their expressions drained of the confidence they once used like a weapon. The lawsuit had shaken them. The public exposure had embarrassed them. And the veterans' rally outside their office had dismantled their invincibility. "Mr. Benton," the president began, his voice stiff, "we'd like to revisit your case." Harold raised an eyebrow. "My case? Or the way you've been running this entire community?" For the first time, the HOA president had no comeback. The man who once barked orders now looked like a student standing before a strict teacher. Harold folded his arms. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fair treatment. Not just for me. For everyone on this street." Silence. Neighbors nodded behind him, some tearful, Some embarrassed, all united for the first time. The HOA president swallowed hard. He knew the truth. They had pushed the wrong man. Not because he was powerful, but because he was righteous. "We'll drop all fines against you," the president finally said. "And we'll revise the rule book, starting today." But Harold wasn't done. "And I want transparency. Vote records made public. No hidden meetings. No selective enforcement." The president hesitated, then nodded. "You have my word." Harold extended his hand, not out of weakness, but out of strength. "This community deserves better. Let's build it together." It was the handshake that changed the street. The people did. The community did. And most importantly, the veteran they tried to silence did. As the board walked away, neighbors surrounded Harold, offering gratitude, apologies, and handshakes. For the first time in a long time, Cedar Pine Lane felt like a neighborhood again. And Harold? He didn't just reclaim his home. He reclaimed his peace. The next morning, something unusual happened. Before sunrise, residents began stepping out of their homes. Quiet at first, almost unsure of how to begin. But one by one, they lined the street, each holding small American flags. Some were old veterans. Some were young families. Some were the same people who once complained about Hank's truck or his wheelchair ramp. But all of them were there. Because overnight, the street had remembered who built it, who protected it, and who actually gave them the freedom to live in peace. As Hank wheeled out of his front door, he stopped, stunned. A long row of neighbors waited for him, and beside them, the news vans were gone. The noise was gone. The anger was gone. Only gratitude remained. A woman stepped forward first, Mrs. Alvarez, the one who had filed the initial complaint. Her eyes were glassy. Her hands shook a little. "Hank, I was wrong," she said softly. "I didn't know your story. And honestly, I never asked. But I want to make this right." Others followed. A father placed his hand on Hank's shoulder. A teenager handed him a folded flag. A couple apologized for signing the HOA surveys without reading them. Then came the moment no one expected. The new HOA president, yes, the one elected after the old board resigned, walked up to Hank with a small envelope. Inside was something simple, but symbolic. A letter stating, "Sergeant Henry Hank Dalton is exempt from HOA restrictions for life, in honor of his service, sacrifice, and continued positive impact on this community." But the second line hit even harder. "This street is dedicated to him." Hank looked up, confused. And then he saw it. Workers drilling a fresh sign into the pole, Dalton Way, named in honor of Sergeant Henry Dalton, U.S. Army. The crowd applauded. Some cried. Some saluted for the first time in a long time. Hank felt seen, not as a burden, not as a rule breaker, not as a man who didn't belong, but as someone who helped build the very freedom that gave this neighborhood life. He swallowed hard, fighting emotion, then raised the folded flag the teenager gave him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I didn't fight for a street sign. I fought so all of you could disagree, argue, live free, and still stand together the next day." The crowd fell silent, because in that moment, they understood something they'd forgotten. A community isn't protected by rules. It's protected by people. People who show up. People who care. People like Hank. Later that afternoon, as he sat on his porch with his dog at his feet, a gentle breeze swept across the newly named Dalton Way. For the first time in years, Hank felt at peace. No more threats. No more hearings. No more fights. Just a street. Finally recognizing the man who defended it long before anyone living there ever arrived. And whether the HOA admitted it or not, they didn't own the street. The man who bled for it did.